Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to have your company once more. Tell me, is there a paper waiting on your desk tonight, some small matter left unfinished? Watson once watched a single missing document unravel a household's quiet order and found that nothing filed away is ever truly settled. Do subscribe so no page goes unturned. Now, listen closely, for as Holmes knew, even silence keeps its records. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, linked below. Chapter 1. The Stillness of Brackley Sessions. Looking back over the singular cases which it has been my privilege to record, I am struck by how frequently the gravest crimes announce themselves not with violence, but with the rustle of paper. A pistol shot, a cry in the night, a body discovered upon a moor, these are the common currency of sensational fiction, and I confess that in my earlier years of chronicling my friends' achievements, I shared something of the public's appetite for such dramatic openings. Yet Sherlock Holmes himself often remarked that the law's quietest instruments, a deed, a will, a signature, could conceal malice as profound as any dagger, and that a man's ruin might be accomplished as thoroughly by the loss of a single document as by the loss of his blood. The affair of the vanished committal order, which I now set down after some years of hesitation, remains for me the clearest proof of that observation. It was a bitter morning in the early days of February, and I had come round to Baker Street to find Holmes in that state of settled indolence which so often preceded, in my experience, a burst of extraordinary activity. He lay stretched upon the sofa in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his eyes half-closed, a briar pipe smoking gently between his fingers, while the coal fire hissed and spat against a wind that rattled the casements without mercy. Mrs. Hudson had only just cleared away the breakfast things, and the morning papers lay in a disordered heap upon the hearth-rug, where Holmes had flung them after a cursory and evidently disappointing perusal. "Nothing in the agony columns to signify," said he, without troubling to open his eyes fully as I entered. "A forged cheque in Peckham, a disputed will in Surrey. Matters for lesser intellects, Watson, and I confess I begin to envy the criminal classes their want of imagination." I had scarcely settled into my accustomed chair by the fire when the bell rang below, and I heard Mrs. Hudson step upon the stair, followed by a lighter and more hesitant tread. Holmes's eyes opened at once with that quickening of attention which I had come to recognise as the herald of business. "A provincial solicitor," said he, "recently arrived by the early train, and troubled in mind if I am any judge of a footstep." Our visitor, when he was shown in, answered to this description with a precision that never failed to astonish me, though I had witnessed such demonstrations 100 times before. He was a small, neat man of perhaps 45, dressed with the sober correctness of his profession, his boots carrying still a fleck or two of country mud, and his gloved hands betraying a slight tremor as he laid his hat upon the table. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "my name is Nathaniel Price, solicitor of Brackley. I must apologise for the earliness of my call, but the matter which brings me will not, I think, bear delay. Pray sit, Mr. Price, and warm yourself before the fire," said Holmes, with that courtesy he never failed to extend to the genuinely distressed, whatever his private impatience with duller matters. "You have come up from Northamptonshire this morning, I perceive, and upon business connected with the Sessions Court, unless I am much mistaken." Our visitor started visibly. "How could you possibly? The mud upon your boots is of a peculiar reddish clay found, I believe, only in that county, and a legal document protrudes, folded in the particular manner of a court paper, from your breast-pocket. But you did not come here to be astonished by parlour tricks, Mr. Price. Tell us your trouble." Mr. Price composed himself with visible effort and proceeded to unfold a tale which, in its essentials, was this: the magistrates' court at Brackley, over which the local justice of the peace, Sir Malcolm Hatherley, presided with what our visitor delicately termed unbending correctness, had been thrown into disorder by the disappearance of a committal order, the formal instrument by which one Abel Renshaw, a young labourer, had been consigned to await trial upon a charge of assaulting Sir Malcolm's steward, during a dispute arising from an eviction. Without this document, properly signed, sealed, and entered, the legality of Renshaw's continued detention stood in grave question, and the young barrister engaged upon his behalf had already begun to make capital of the irregularity. "You will understand, Mr. Holmes," said Price, "that this touches the very dignity of the bench. Sir Malcolm is spoken of as the injured party, and indeed he regards himself so. But I should not be candid with you if I did not confess that Sir Malcolm is not universally beloved in Brackley. He is charitable in his public capacity, a subscriber to the almshouse, a builder of schools, but he's a hard man in the exercise of his office, and there are those among his tenants who have felt the full and unmitigated weight of his lawful severity." Holmes had listened throughout with his fingertips joined before him, his eyes fixed upon the middle distance in the manner I knew so well. "The suspects I collect are few, since the court is small. There is myself," said Price with a rueful smile, "though I discovered the loss and have no conceivable motive. There is Miss Eleanor Vane, our court copyist, a most precise and dutiful young woman. There is old Mr. Josiah Bell, the clerk of sessions, who has served the court, man and boy, these 40 years. There is the Reverend Ambrose Keene, a mild-mannered reformer who chanced to visit the court upon the very day, and who has spoken openly against the harshness of Renshaw's committal. And there is Captain Lionel Hatherley, Sir Malcolm's nephew, outwardly devoted to his uncle, though I have heard it whispered that his devotion owes something to his dependence upon Sir Malcolm's purse." "A document," said Holmes at last, rising and reaching for his pipe with the air of a man already half committed, "does not vanish, Mr. Price. It is made to appear as though it has done so, which is a very different matter, and one considerably more interesting. Watson, I think we shall take the 11:15 from Euston. Mr. Price, you will oblige me by touching nothing further in the court records, and by saying nothing of our coming until we arrive." And so it was that within the hour I found myself once more packing my bag for an expedition into the English countryside, wondering, as I so often had before, what strange and orderly wickedness awaited us beneath the tranquil surface of a provincial town. Chapter 2. A courtroom without disorder. The train set us down at Brackley Station a little after 2 o'clock, in a thin, persistent rain that seemed to have settled itself upon the county for the duration of our visit. Mr. Price had wired ahead, and a trap was waiting to carry us the short distance into the town, past hedgerows still black with winter and fields lying fallow beneath a leaden sky. Holmes said little upon the journey, though I observed him studying the passing countryside with that peculiar intentness he reserved for details which other men would call trivial, the state of the roads, the condition of the cottages, the manner in which the local labourers touched their caps to our driver. "You are memorising the district," I remarked. "I am reading it, Watson, which is a different exercise. A man's crime is very often written in the soil he walks upon, quite as legibly as in the deed he commits." He said no more, and I did not press him, knowing from long experience that such observations were seeds rather than conclusions. The courthouse at Brackley proved to be a modest stone building of the last century, dignified without ostentation, standing at the head of the market square. We were received by Mr. Bell, the clerk of sessions, a stooped and courteous old gentleman with silver whiskers and ink-stained fingers, who conducted us within with an air of subdued anxiety. What struck me immediately upon entering was the extraordinary order of the place. I had expected, I confess, something of the dusty confusion one associates with provincial record-keeping. Leaning towers of yellowed paper, ledgers thick with dust, the general disarray of a busy and understaffed office. Instead, I found the ledgers ranged with mathematical precision upon their shelves, the inkstands polished and full, the very blotting paper unmarked save where recent use had left its trace. Every official we encountered spoke with a calm, almost rehearsed cooperation that I found, without quite knowing why, faintly oppressive. Sir Malcolm Hatherley received us in his private chamber, a tall, spare man of 60, with iron grey hair cut close to a skull that seemed carved rather than moulded, and eyes of a pale, unyielding blue. His manner was civil, but there was a coldness beneath the civility that no courtesy could entirely warm. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending a hand that gripped mine and Holmes's with equal measured firmness, "I'm obliged to you for your promptness, though I confess I had rather hoped this matter might have been resolved without recourse to a private investigator. It is not merely my dignity that suffers, sir, but the dignity of the law itself. A committal order does not simply vanish from a well-conducted court. Someone has laid hands upon it, and I mean to see that person answer for it." "You regard the law, I think, as a possession rather than a principle," said Holmes quietly, seating himself uninvited in the chair opposite the magistrate's desk. Sir Malcolm's brows drew together. "I regard it, Mr. Holmes, as the one thing standing between civilization and the mob. I have administered it in this district for 35 years, and I do not propose to see it made a mockery of by whatever hand has done this." I confess that I found something in the magistrate's bearing which chilled me, though I could not have said precisely what. Holmes, for his part, betrayed nothing beyond a polite attention, though I knew him well enough to recognise the faint narrowing of his eyes that signified a judgment already half formed. The missing document, Sir Malcolm explained, concerned one Abel Renshaw, a young labourer upon the Hatherley estate, who had struck the steward during a dispute over an eviction some weeks past. "The fellow acted in temper," said Sir Malcolm, "and temper is no defence known to English law. His friends will tell you he acted from desperation. I dare say the law makes no distinction, nor should it." "And yet," said Holmes, "the law without the order to support it may presently have no power to hold him at all." Sir Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further upon the point, and presently conducted us into the courtroom itself, where the theft, if theft it were, had occurred. It was here that I observed Holmes at his most characteristic, while Sir Malcolm and Mr. Price stood conversing near the door. My friend moved about the chamber with the silent, deliberate tread of a man walking upon consecrated ground, examining in turn the magistrate's bench, the clerk's worn desk, the tall pigeonholes ranged along the western wall, and a heavy document press secured with a brass lock. He paused longest before the fireplace, where a coal fire had evidently burned throughout the previous afternoon, now reduced to a bed of grey and lifeless ash. "Nothing here appears disturbed," I ventured when he had completed his circuit. "Precisely so, Watson, and there is the interest of it. Real disorder, when it occurs, is careless and leaves 100 small traces. A drawer left ajar, a paper out of sequence, a chair moved an inch from its accustomed place. But this room has the unnatural tidiness of a stage set for a play, whose author wishes us to see nothing he has not chosen to show us." We spoke, in turn, with each of the persons who had access to the court upon the day in question. Miss Eleanor Vane, a composed young woman with grave dark eyes, stated plainly that she had copied the committal order that morning and delivered the original into Mr. Bell's keeping. Bell himself, questioned separately, confirmed that he had entered the order into the index and placed it within the document press before the dinner hour. Price recalled seeing the order sealed with his own eyes. The Reverend Ambrose Keene, a gentle, earnest man who had called that afternoon upon a charitable errand, admitted freely that he had pleaded with Sir Malcolm for mercy toward young Renshaw, but denied absolutely that he had touched any paper belonging to the court. Captain Lionel Hatherley, a handsome, languid young man in the modern military fashion, treated the entire affair with an amusement that struck me as somewhat forced. "You cannot seriously suppose," said he, lounging against the door-frame with studied carelessness, "that any of us would trouble ourselves over a labourer's committal. It is absurd, Mr. Holmes. The thing has been mislaid, nothing more." "Documents of legal consequence are rarely mislaid, Captain Hatherley," Holmes replied. "They are removed, and removal implies purpose." As we walked back toward our lodgings that evening through the darkening square, I confessed to Holmes my growing suspicion that the matter might, after all, prove nothing more than an unfortunate clerical error, a paper misfiled amid the ordinary confusions of a busy office. Holmes shook his head slowly, drawing his collar against the rain. "You saw the room, Watson, as I did. There was not a paper out of place, not a mark of haste, Not a single honest trace of accident from end to end of that chamber. I tell you, a room so scrupulously ordered is more eloquent of design than the wildest confusion could ever be. Someone in Brackley possesses a very cool head indeed, and I confess I am eager to make that person's better acquaintance. Chapter 3. The legal incident becomes a scandal. The Brackley Advertiser, which was brought up with our breakfast the following morning at the Crown Inn, had given the affair a prominence I had not anticipated. Committal order missing ran the headline. Renshaw's counsel demands immediate release. I read the column aloud to Holmes as he sat buttering his toast with an abstraction that told me his mind had already outrun the newspaper's account. Renshaw's barrister has lost no time, said I. He argues that without the order properly filed, the detention was never lawful, and that the man must be freed forthwith. A sound argument, from a legal point of view, and an inconvenient one from every other, Holmes replied. You will observe, Watson, that scandal has a way of accelerating truth. Sir Malcolm's careful and orderly little world will not remain undisturbed much longer. Nor did it. By the time we had walked round to the courthouse, we found the market square alive with a curiosity quite unusual, I was assured, in so quiet a town. Knots of townsfolk stood about discussing the matter with the particular relish that country people reserve for the discomfiture of their betters, and I overheard more than one voice suggesting that the whole affair smelled less of incompetence than of something considerably darker. Mr. Bell met us at the door, his old face grey with worry. The newspapers have got hold of it, mister. Holmes, and I fear worse than the newspapers. There is talk of an inquiry from the Home Office itself, should the matter not be settled quietly and soon. Holmes questioned him closely, and from Bell and afterward from Miss Vane and Price in turn, we were able to establish the narrow window within which the document must have vanished. Miss Vane had completed her fair copy of the order shortly after 11, and had at once carried the original to Bell for entry into the index, a task he had performed by his own precise account at 11:30. Price had come for certified copies to convey to the jail only at 4 in the afternoon, and it was then, and not before, that the loss was discovered. Between 11:30 and 4 o'clock, then, the order had lain within the document press, safe, by every account, from any hand but those with legitimate business in the room. A window of some 4.5 hours, Holmes observed, during which the court was not, I think, wholly unoccupied. No, indeed, said Bell. I took my dinner at 1, in the back room, but the court itself is never left entirely unwatched. Miss Vane was at her desk until 2. The Reverend Keene called upon Sir Malcolm at 2:30, and remained the better part of an hour. Captain Hatherley looked in some time after 3, I believe, though I could not swear to the precise hour. It was as we sat that afternoon in the small parlour allotted to us at the Crown that Holmes laid before me, with the deliberation of a man setting out cards upon a table, the several motives which had begun to declare themselves. Consider the Reverend Keene, said he, a man who has pleaded, and pleaded in vain, for mercy toward Renshaw, and who was alone with Sir Malcolm for the better part of an hour during the very window in question. Consider Miss Vane, whose composure I do not doubt, but whose brother, as Price let fall to me only this morning, was ruined some years since by a judgment of Sir Malcolm's own making. Consider old Bell, who fears dismissal by his own admission, following some recent error in his indexing, and who has served the court so long that its every drawer and lock must be as familiar to him as his own hand. Consider Price himself, who discovered the loss, and who might, in the resulting confusion, find his own standing in the district considerably enhanced. And consider, lastly, Captain Hatherley, who stands to inherit a very comfortable fortune should scandal weaken his uncle's position, or worse. It is a formidable list, said I. It is a list, Watson, and no more. Motive is the cheapest commodity in the world. Every man alive possesses dozen reasons to wish some other man ill. It is opportunity and evidence that narrow the field, and of evidence we have as yet remarkably little. He rose and reached for his hat. I think we shall return to the courtroom before the light fails entirely. It was upon this second visit that Holmes made the observations which he was afterward to weigh so carefully. Kneeling upon the floor beside the clerk's desk, a posture which drew, I confess, some curious glances from the constable stationed at the door, he presently rose with a small object held delicately between finger and thumb. A smudge of red sealing wax, Watson, fallen beneath the desk and not yet trodden into the boards. Sealing wax does not fall of its own accord. It is dropped in the process of use, generally in some haste or distraction. He pocketed the fragment carefully in an envelope and turned next to the blotting sheet upon the desk itself, which he studied for some minutes beneath the fading window light, tilting it this way and that. A faint crease here, quite recent, running across an otherwise unused corner of the paper. Someone has folded this blotting sheet, Watson, though for what purpose I cannot yet say. It was Miss Vane, summoned once more to answer a further question, who supplied the last curiosity of the afternoon. "The paperweight," said she, in answer to Holmes's casual inquiry as to the desk's usual furnishings. "Why, there was always a small brass paperweight kept beside the document press, to hold down loose papers when the window was open. I do not recall having seen it these past 2 days, now that you mention it." Holmes said nothing to this beyond a murmured word of thanks, but I saw his eyes brighten with that particular light which I had long since learned to associate with a scent freshly taken. We returned to the Crown that evening to find a note awaiting Sir Malcolm's household, a copy of which the magistrate had thought fit to send round to us in some agitation. It was written in a rough, disguised hand, and read simply, "You buried Mercy once. Now the law buries you." There was no signature, nor any mark to indicate its origin. "A dramatic sentiment," I remarked, "and one that points very plainly toward Reverend Keene, or toward someone who shares his sympathies for Renshaw. It points, Watson, precisely where its author intended it to point, which is a very different matter from where the truth actually lies. Sincerity has its own accent, and I do not hear it in these words. This note has been composed, not felt, written by a hand that wishes us to look one direction while events proceed quietly in another." He folded the paper and laid it upon the table with something like distaste. "We shall keep it none the less. Even a false trail tells us something of the mind that laid it." Chapter 4. The Fire That Burned Too Cleanly. We had scarcely finished our breakfast the next morning when a constable arrived at the Crown with word that Inspector Garrity, the local officer charged with the case, desired Holmes's presence at the courthouse without delay. Some discovery had been made, the man said, that promised to settle the whole affair, and I confess that Holmes's countenance, upon hearing this, betrayed more scepticism than satisfaction. "A discovery that promises to settle a case so early in its course, Watson, generally settles nothing but the investigator's patience," said he, drawing on his coat. "Still, we shall see what has been found." We found Inspector Garrity, a stout, energetic man with side whiskers and a manner of settled certainty, kneeling before the courtroom fireplace, where the ashes of the previous afternoon's fire had been carefully raked out upon a sheet of brown paper spread across the hearthstone. Sir Malcolm stood by, his pale eyes fixed upon the little heap of grey debris, with an expression I found difficult to read. "There, Mr. Holmes," said Garrity, not without a certain triumph in his voice, indicating a small blackened fragment among the ash. "A piece of paper, not wholly consumed, and if I am not mistaken, a portion of Sir Malcolm's own signature upon it. The order was burned in this very grate, sir, and burned, I should say, by someone with excellent reason to see it destroyed." Holmes took up the fragment with the delicate care he reserved for evidence of consequence, and examined it a long while beneath the window light before he spoke. "You're quite right that a signature is here, Inspector, or the remnant of one. But I would ask you to consider the texture of the paper itself." He held it toward the light that we might all observe it. "The committal order, as I understand from Mr. Bell, was engrossed upon the thick blue court paper reserved for such instruments, a heavy, laid paper with a particular blue tint derived from its manufacture. This fragment, gentlemen, is thin, white, and of a texture I associate rather with ordinary correspondence than with any legal instrument. Garrity's confidence wavered visibly. It might have curled and altered in the burning Mr. Holmes. Fire alters colour and substance, Inspector, but it doesn't alter the weave of a paper's fibres, which remain legible to a careful eye even in ash. This is not the committal order. It is a fragment of some other document, burned, I should say deliberately burned, to suggest a conclusion which the true evidence does not support. Sir Malcolm's face darkened. Then you believe, sir, that someone has gone to the trouble of manufacturing false evidence in my own courtroom, beneath my own roof? I believe it exceedingly probable, Sir Malcolm, and I should be glad to know who among your household or your court had access to correspondence paper and to this hearth within the past 2 days. No very satisfactory answer was forthcoming, and Garrity, though plainly reluctant to abandon so promising a theory, allowed Holmes to continue his examination undisturbed. It was then that my friend turned his attention, somewhat to the inspector's bewilderment, away from the ashes altogether and toward the fire-irons themselves, which stood in their stand beside the hearth. You will forgive me, Inspector, if I confess greater interest in this poker than in your fragment of ash. Holmes lifted the implement and turned it slowly beneath the light, running his thumb along the handle with the delicate attention of a man reading Braille. A trace of wax here near the grip, Watson. Do you observe it? Red wax and warmed, I think, rather than merely touched in its solid state. You suggest the poker was used to melt wax, I asked. I suggest, rather, that the poker was heated in this fire and then applied to a quantity of sealing wax elsewhere, for a purpose we have not yet fully determined. Consider, gentlemen. If a man wished to suggest that a sealed document had perished in these flames, he might contrive to leave behind some trace of melted wax, precisely such as a burning seal would produce. The fire, in this case, was not employed to destroy evidence at all. It was employed to manufacture the appearance of destruction. I confess that even Garrity, sceptical as he had shown himself, could offer no ready objection to this reasoning, and Sir Malcolm's countenance had by now assumed an expression of controlled alarm that I had not observed in him before. It was into this uneasy scene that word arrived, brought by a breathless clerk from the post office, of the anonymous note which had reached Sir Malcolm's household the previous evening, the very message Holmes and I had already seen, but which the household staff had only now thought proper to report to the police. Garrity seized upon it at once as confirmation of his theory. There, Mr. Holmes, you buried mercy once, now the law buries you. It points directly at the Reverend Keene, does it not? The man has argued openly for Renshaw's release, and here is a message dripping with the very sentiment of a clergyman's conscience. It points where its author wished it to point, Inspector, which I have already had occasion to observe is not invariably the same direction as the truth. Holmes folded his arms and regarded the fireplace a moment longer in silence. Consider the note itself. It is dramatic in its language, biblical in its cadence, and calculated, I think, to inflame suspicion rather than to confess it. A man who is truly burned with conscience does not generally pause to compose so theatrical a sentence before making his confession known. This note was written, Inspector, not felt. Sir Malcolm, who had listened to this exchange with growing impatience, broke in at last. Then who, Mr. Holmes, if not Keene? You have dismissed the fragment, dismissed the note. Will you leave us with no theory at all, and my court still disgraced before the county? I have dismissed nothing, Sir Malcolm, save 2 conclusions offered prematurely upon evidence too convenient to be entirely honest. I would remind you that the cleverest deception is not the one which leaves no trace, but the one which leaves precisely the trace an unwary investigator expects to find. Someone in this affair possesses a shrewder head than either the ash in your grate or the ink upon that note would suggest, and it is that mind, rather than these small manufactured proofs, which I intend to follow. We left the courthouse as the light was failing, and I observed that Holmes walked the whole way back to the Crown in a silence broken only once, when he remarked, half to himself and half to me, that a man clever enough to stage 2 false trails in as many days was unlikely to have exhausted his invention, and that our vigilance from this point forward must extend to every particular, however small. Chapter 5. Conscience Behind Polite Faces. I propose this morning, Watson, to ask no questions whatever about paperweights or blotting sheets, said Holmes, as we walked together through the market square in the pale sunshine that had, for once, broken through Brackley's habitual grey. I have gathered evidence enough for the present. What I've not gathered is the temper of the minds I'm dealing with, and that I think is not to be discovered by asking a man where he stood at 2:30, but by asking him what he fears. I confess I did not immediately grasp his meaning, but I had learned long since that Holmes's methods, however unconventional they appeared at the outset, generally justified themselves before the day was out. We began with Miss Vane, whom we found at her desk in the clerk's office, her pen moving across a ledger with the same unhurried precision I had observed in her from the first. "Miss Vane," said Holmes, seating himself unbidden across from her, "I will not trouble you further with questions of hours and documents. Tell me only this. What did you fear most, should Renshaw have come to trial?" She set down her pen slowly, and I saw her composure, so steady until that moment, waver very slightly. "I feared nothing for Renshaw, Mr. Holmes. I scarcely know the man. I feared only error, that some mistake of mine in the copying might be found to blame, and my position lost with it." "And yet," said Holmes gently, "your hand trembles now, Miss Vane, at the mere mention of Sir Malcolm's judgments, though I have said nothing of any judgment in particular." There was a long silence, and I saw the young woman's eyes fill, though she mastered herself with an effort that did her credit. "My brother, Mr. Holmes, was tried before Sir Malcolm 11 years ago upon a charge of removing property from an estate where he had been employed. He was guilty in the narrow sense. He did take what was not his, but he acted, I have always believed, under compulsion from another, a debt he could not otherwise discharge. Sir Malcolm would hear nothing of mitigation. My brother was transported, and I have not seen him since." She looked up at Holmes with something like defiance. "But I did not touch that order, sir, whatever you may suspect of me." "I suspect you of grief, Miss Vane, which is not a crime, whatever else it may resemble." Holmes rose and thanked her with a courtesy I thought genuinely felt, and we left her to her ledgers, though I observed him glance back once, thoughtfully, before we passed through the door. Old Bell we found in the small back room where the court's older records were kept, arranging bundles of yellowed paper with hands that, for all their age, moved with a clerk's habitual neatness. He answered Holmes's question, what he feared, should the truth of the missing order come fully to light, with a directness that surprised me. "I have served this court 40 years, Mr. Holmes, faithfully, as I believe any man would tell you, but I am old, and I have made an error or two of late. Nothing grave, mind you, a misfiled paper, a date entered wrong, and I have had it hinted to me, not in plain words, that my retirement would not be unwelcome to Sir Malcolm." His voice shook a little. "I fear poverty, sir, plainly. I have no pension to speak of, and no family near enough to keep me." I observed, as he spoke, that Holmes's gaze had fallen upon the old man's cuffs, brushed and mended with evident care, save for a small mark of pale blue dust near the left wrist. The unmistakable residue, as I now knew from our examination of the document press, of the heavy court paper kept within it. "You have been near the press recently, Mr. Bell," Holmes observed without accusation in his tone. "Why, of course, sir, a dozen times a day. It is my charge to keep it." The old man's answer came readily enough, and Holmes pressed the point no further, though I saw him make a small note in the book he carried. The Reverend Keene we discovered at the vicarage, tending a small garden with more devotion than skill, his black coat dusted with the same February soil that clung yet to his boots. He answered Holmes's question at once, and without any of the hesitation the others had shown. "I fear injustice, Mr. Holmes, plainly and simply. I have prayed with Renshaw in his cell. He is not a violent man by nature. He was driven to it by circumstance, by an eviction he believed unjust, and by a steward who showed him no more mercy than a dog might expect. I have pleaded with Sir Malcolm to temper the law with some Christian charity, and I have been refused. That is the whole of my offence, sir, and I will not pretend otherwise. You did not, then, remove the order yourself from any charitable impulse? The clergyman's mild eyes met Holmes's without flinching. I did not, mister. Holmes, though I will confess I have wished in weaker moments that Providence might have arranged the matter for me. Holmes studied him a long moment. You are troubled, Mr. Keene, but I do not think you theatrical, and the note left for Sir Malcolm was, above all things, theatrical. I do not believe you wrote it. We found Captain Hatherley last at the small inn stables where he was engaged in examining a horse's fetlock with the careless expertise of a cavalry officer. To Holmes's question he returned only a short laugh. Fear, Mr. Holmes? I fear my uncle's temper when his port is corked, and precious little else. I have no interest in Renshaw, guilty or innocent, and less in the dusty business of the court. Yet as he turned to lead the horse back toward its stall, I observed, as Holmes plainly had before me, that a rim of pale clay clung yet to the heel of his boot, a clay I had by now come to associate from our walk of the previous day, not with the courthouse yard, which was paved, but with the unpaved lane leading toward the county jail. You have been to Northgate recently, Captain Hatherley, Holmes remarked, with the same deceptive mildness he had shown the others. The captain's easy manner did not alter, though I fancied I saw something flicker behind his eyes. A man may walk where he pleases, Mr. Holmes, without answering for it to every passing stranger. Undoubtedly, said Holmes, and we took our leave. As we walked back toward the Crown in the fading afternoon light, I remarked that we seemed to have gathered 5 confessions of fear and not 1 confession of guilt. That is very often the pattern, Watson, in cases where the guilt is real, said Holmes. A man's fear tells you what he has to lose, and a man's manner under the asking of it tells you very often more than his words. Miss Vane's grief is genuine, and grief of that particular vintage rarely sharpens itself into so cool a crime as this. Bell's fear is genuine also, but fear of poverty makes for trembling hands, not for the steady nerve this matter has required throughout. Keene is sincere to the point of indiscretion, and sincerity of that stamp does not commonly write anonymous threats in a disguised hand. There remains, Watson, a young man with mud from the Northgate Road upon his boots, and an amusement a shade too determined to be entirely natural. He said no more upon the subject that evening, but I noticed that he wrote a good while in his notebook before retiring, and that his candle burned late into the Brackley night. Chapter 6. Loyalty, Fear, and Old Injustice. And it was Price who suggested, over a breakfast taken in near silence, that the older records of the court might repay examination, and Holmes seized upon the notion with an eagerness that surprised our host. You have put your finger upon the very thing I had been about to propose myself, Mr. Price, said he, pushing aside his plate. A man's present conduct is very often written in his past grievances, and I confess a curiosity to learn what manner of case first brought Miss Vane's family within Sir Malcolm's jurisdiction. We spent the better part of that morning, then, in the dim and dusty archive room adjoining the clerk's office, where bound volumes of old sessions stretched back some 40 years upon groaning shelves. Bell, though plainly uneasy at the errand, assisted us in locating the volume we required, and it was there, among yellowed depositions and faded ink, that Holmes uncovered the history which Price had only hinted at before. The case, dating back some 11 years, concerned one Thomas Vane, Miss Eleanor's elder brother, charged with the removal of certain valuables from the estate of a Colonel Fenwick, in whose service he had been employed as a bailiff's clerk. The bare facts, as recorded, were damning enough. Vane had certainly carried away articles of plate and jewellery not his own. Yet Holmes, reading with the swift, absorbing attention I had seen him bring to 100 such documents, presently gave a low exclamation. Look here, Watson, a deposition, taken but never entered into evidence, from a servant named Hodge, testifying that Vane had been threatened by a moneylender's agent with violence to his sister, should certain debts not be discharged, and that the removal of the Colonel's property was undertaken by Vane's own confession to Hodge under the most direct compulsion. He turned the page. This deposition bears Sir Malcolm's own initial in the margin, and yet I find no trace of its having been read into the record at trial. You suggest it was suppressed? I asked, scarcely crediting the thought even as I spoke it. I suggest, Watson, that Sir Malcolm chose to regard the letter of the law rather than its spirit, and that a piece of evidence which might have won young Vane a lighter sentence, or perhaps none at all, was set quietly aside as inconvenient to a swift and exemplary judgment. It is not forgery, nor is it, strictly speaking, a crime in law, but it is the sort of old injustice that leaves a very deep root in a sister's memory. I confess that this discovery gave me pause, for it seemed to furnish Miss Vane with a motive graver than any we had yet uncovered. Yet Holmes, closing the volume with a certain grimness, did not appear satisfied. A powerful motive, certainly, and I do not doubt her grief is genuine, nor that this old wrong burns in her still. But motive without calculation does not commit so cool a crime as this one, Watson, and I have seen nothing in Miss Vane's conduct that suggests the necessary coldness. We shall keep this discovery in mind, but I do not rest upon it. It was in the course of that same afternoon that Holmes turned his attention once more to old Bell, questioning him now in private, with a gentleness that seemed to loosen the old clerk's tongue where sterner methods might have closed it. You spoke, Mr. Bell, of a recent indexing error which you feared might cost you your position. I should be glad of the particulars. Bell's shoulders sagged, and he confessed with evident shame that Sir Malcolm had indeed spoken to him some weeks past of a quiet retirement, following a misfiled record that had briefly embarrassed the court. I have nowhere to go, Mr. Holmes, and no means but this position. I did not touch the committal order. I swear it before heaven. But I will not pretend I do not fear what its loss may yet cost me. It was in this same interview that a small contradiction first declared itself, one which Holmes was to weigh carefully in the days that followed. Bell stated, with every appearance of certainty, that he had locked the document press before going to his dinner at 1 o'clock, as was his invariable custom. Yet Miss Vane, questioned again that same afternoon upon an unrelated point, mentioned in passing that she had observed the key still hanging in the lock when she returned to her desk after 2, a discrepancy which, when I remarked upon it to Holmes, he received with evident interest. One of them is mistaken, Watson, or one of them is not speaking the whole truth. I incline to think it error rather than falsehood, in Bell's case at least. A man of 40 years' habit may easily suppose he has performed a customary act, when in fact upon this one occasion he did not. But the open lock is a fact of some consequence, however it came about, for it tells us that the press stood unsecured for a portion of that critical afternoon. That evening Holmes proposed that we should walk out to Northgate Jail, a mile or so beyond the town, where Renshaw himself was held pending the resolution of his case. The jailer, a heavy taciturn man named Firth, received us without enthusiasm, but was persuaded by Holmes's card and by a certain quiet authority in his manner to produce the delivery book in which documents received from the court were duly recorded. It was here that Holmes made the discovery which I believe first set his thoughts moving decisively toward their eventual conclusion. Among the entries was a duplicate slip, acknowledging receipt of certain papers relating to Renshaw's committal, papers which, Firth explained, were customarily forwarded in advance of the order itself as a formality. Holmes examined this slip beneath his lens for some minutes, and I observed that one corner had been clipped away, not torn but cut cleanly, as though to remove some mark or notation that had once appeared there. "You have had a visitor from the Atherley family, I think, Mr. Firth, in recent days," said Holmes, without looking up from his examination. The jailer started slightly. "Why, yes, sir, now you mention it. Captain Hatherley called here the day before yesterday, saying he carried a personal message from Sir Malcolm concerning the prisoner's treatment. I saw no harm in it, sir, the captain being family to the magistrate." "Did he examine this book?" "He did ask to see it, sir, saying he wished to confirm that all was in order, on his uncle's behalf." Holmes said nothing further to the jailer, but as we walked back toward Brackley through the deepening dusk, he spoke with a quiet decisiveness I had not heard from him since the case began. We have supposed throughout, Watson, that the committal order was destroyed, burned, as the false evidence in the grate would have had us believe. I begin to think we have supposed wrongly. A man does not clip a corner from a jail's delivery book merely to remove an ink blot. I think it exceedingly probable that the order was never destroyed at all, but displaced, hidden perhaps in some place we have not yet thought to look, or carried away under cover of some ordinary and unremarkable errand. And I think, moreover, that we have already met the gentleman most likely to have carried it. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. We had scarcely finished breakfast the next morning when Inspector Garrity himself appeared at the Crown, his side whiskers fairly bristling with satisfaction, to inform us that the case, in his own words, had settled itself. The Reverend Ambrose Keene, he announced, had that very morning presented himself at the police station and confessed, freely and without reservation, to having burned the committal order with his own hand. He says he acted from Christian conscience, Mr. Holmes, believing the boy's imprisonment an injustice, and I am bound to say the man showed no want of courage in the telling of it. Sir Malcolm is naturally gratified to have the matter closed, and I confess I see no reason to look further. Holmes received this intelligence with a stillness I had learned to distrust. I should like to hear Mr. Keene's account from his own lips, Inspector, before the matter is considered closed beyond recall. We found the clergyman in a small bare room at the police station, seated with his hands folded before him, and an expression of settled, almost peaceful resignation upon his mild features, as of a man who has at last laid down some heavy burden. He rose as we entered, and greeted Holmes without embarrassment. "I do not wonder that you have come, Mr. Holmes. I owe you, I think, a fuller account than I have given the Inspector." "I should be glad of it," said Holmes, seating himself opposite. "Tell me, in your own words, precisely how the thing was done." Keene related his tale with the fluency of a man who has rehearsed it, perhaps in his own conscience, many times before speaking it aloud. He had called upon Sir Malcolm that afternoon, he said, to plead once more for mercy toward Renshaw, and finding himself alone in the courtroom for some minutes while Sir Malcolm was called away, had yielded to a sudden and overwhelming impulse. He had gone to the document press, taken the order from among the papers within, and cast it into the fire, believing that its loss must delay, if not altogether prevent, the young man's trial. "And the press, Mr. Keene," said Holmes with no apparent emphasis, "was it locked when you came to it, or did you find it open?" "Open, Mr. Holmes. I recall lifting the lid quite easily." "You are certain of that?" "There was no difficulty in the opening." "None whatever, sir. I took the order and closed it again, and no one, I believe, observed me." Holmes asked one or two further questions of small apparent consequence, and thanked the clergyman with a courtesy that gave no hint of the doubt I could see working behind his eyes. We left him to Garrity's custody, and walked out into the square, where a thin winter sun was doing its best against a bank of grey cloud. "You do not believe him," said I, when we had gone some way in silence. "I believe every word of his moral account, Watson, and not one particular of his physical one. Keene's confession contains truth of the heart and falsehood of the hand, which is a very curious combination, and one that generally signifies a man protecting someone other than himself." He paused beside the market cross, his expression troubled. "You will recall, when we first examined the document press, that its door does not lift freely. The hinge has warped with age, and I observed for myself in Bell's presence that it must be lifted an inch or more at the near corner before it will open at all, a peculiarity Bell himself remarked upon as a long-standing nuisance of the room. A man who had genuinely opened that press would remember the motion. It is the sort of small physical awkwardness that impresses itself upon the memory, quite apart from any deliberate act of recollection. Keene says he lifted the lid quite easily. I do not think he has ever opened that press in his life. I confess the observation struck me forcibly, trivial as it might have seemed to a less attentive mind. Then why confess at all to a crime he did not commit? That, Watson, is precisely the question I mean to put to him, though I doubt very much he will answer it honestly upon a first asking." We returned that same afternoon, and Holmes, dismissing the constable at the door with a quiet word, sat down once more opposite the clergyman and regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Keene, I do not believe you burned that order. I believe you have never in your life opened the document press in the courtroom, for you do not know that its lid must be lifted before it will swing free, a fault which every person who has genuinely handled it remembers well. I ask you, therefore, plainly, whom are you protecting?" The clergyman's composure, so steady until this moment, broke at last, and I saw something very like relief pass across his troubled features, as though the maintaining of his falsehood had cost him more than the confession itself. "You are a remarkable man, Mr. Holmes," said he low. "I will not deny what you have said, but I cannot tell you the name, sir, whatever the cost to myself. I have given my word, and I will not break it, even to save my own liberty." Was it given freely, this promise, or extracted under some pressure of conscience or affection? "Freely, Mr. Holmes, and I do not repent it, though I see now it has served no purpose but to delay a truth you seem determined to uncover in any event." Holmes rose, and I saw in his manner none of the triumph I might have expected at so significant an admission, but rather a kind of grave respect. "You're a loyal man, Mr. Keene, and I do not think the worse of you for it, whatever Inspector Garrity may say when he learns his case has collapsed beneath him. I would ask only that you consider, before you persist in silence, whether the person you shield is entirely deserving of a sacrifice that would see an innocent man convicted in your place." We left him then, and I observed, as we walked back through the gathering dusk, that Holmes's face wore an expression of unusual gravity. He protects someone he believes acted from a motive he can respect, Watson. Mercy or loyalty or grief perhaps, but not malice. That much I am certain of. Whether his estimate of that motive is correct is quite another matter, and one I mean to test before another day has passed. Garrity, when informed that evening of the collapse of his tidy solution, received the news with considerably less grace than Keene had shown in confessing to a crime not his own, and Sir Malcolm, summoned to hear the same intelligence, paced his study in a fury that seemed to me to owe as much to wounded pride as to any concern for justice. "Then we are precisely where we began," said he bitterly, "save that a clergyman has made fools of us all, and the true offender walks free among us still." "Not precisely where we began, Sir Malcolm," Holmes replied, with a quiet firmness that silenced the magistrate's complaint. "I would ask you to grant me one further hour in your courtroom tomorrow, undisturbed. I believe the matter may then be very swiftly concluded." Chapter 8. The overlooked physical detail. Sir Malcolm had granted the promised hour with poor grace, and it was in an empty courtroom, the winter light falling grey and even through the tall windows, that Holmes set about his final examination. He had asked that nothing be moved or disturbed since our last visit, and I found him, upon our arrival, already bent low over the clerk's desk, the blotting sheet held at a sharp angle against the pane of glass so that the light struck its surface obliquely. "Come here, Watson, and tell me what you see." I bent beside him and studied the sheet as he directed, and after a moment my eye caught what his had evidently found already: a faint, reversed impression pressed into the blotting paper's fibres, legible only at this particular angle of light, as though some heavier document had once lain upon it and left the ghost of its own writing behind. "I can make out letters," said I slowly, "though they run backward. R-E-N-S-H-A-D, and below it something further, committed. Something Northgate Jail." The official endorsement of the committal order, Watson, pressed into this blotting sheet by the weight of a hand writing upon the order itself, or perhaps by the order being laid face down upon damp ink not yet fully dry. Observe that this impression lies upon a corner of the sheet we had not examined closely before. The crease I remarked upon some days ago runs directly across it, as though the sheet had been folded to conceal this very mark from a casual glance. He straightened, his eyes bright with the particular satisfaction I had come to recognise as the herald of a case nearing its close. This proves a fact of some moment. The order lay upon this desk, and was written upon or handled here, after the hour at which Bell swears he had already filed it within the press. Someone therefore removed it from the press, brought it back to this desk, and only then carried it finally away. But why return it to the desk at all, if the intention was simply to remove it? That, Watson, is precisely the question that has been troubling me, and I think I begin to see its answer. He turned from the desk and crossed to the document press itself, kneeling before it and drawing open, one by one, the several small drawers set beneath its main compartment. Drawers given over, as Bell had earlier explained, to old parchment wrappers, spare seals, and the general debris of a long-established office. In the third of these, beneath a fold of disused wrapping paper, his searching fingers closed upon a small object which he drew out and held up to the light with an air of quiet triumph. It was the missing brass paperweight. Bell has been indexing in this room daily and never troubled to look beneath a wrapper he supposed empty, Holmes murmured, turning the object over in his hands. Small wonder. It is precisely the sort of hiding place the eye slides over, being too obvious in its ordinariness to arouse suspicion. He held the paperweight beneath his lens, and I saw upon its flat underside a thin curved mark, pale blue against the dulled brass. A crescent of fibre, Watson, from the court's own blue paper, pressed into the metal by considerable and sustained weight, and here, along the edge, a trace of red wax, harder and older than the smear we found upon the poker handle. You believe the paperweight was used to press the order flat or to hold it? I believe, Watson, that the true mechanism of this theft has eluded us because we supposed the order was carried away alone, when in fact it was carried away beneath something else, pressed flat under this weight, together with some other bundle of papers being removed from the room in the ordinary course of business, and thereby smuggled past any eye that might otherwise have marked a single document walking out unaccompanied. It was not filed, Watson. It was pressed and lifted and carried out beneath the cover of routine. I confess that the ingenuity of such a method, once stated, struck me as both simple and formidable. Simple in its materials, formidable in the coolness of mind required to conceive it in the small compass of a single afternoon. Holmes was not yet finished. Yet. He returned to the hearth, where the fire iron stood as before, and lifted the poker once more, studying the trace of wax upon its handle, with a frown of concentration I had seen him wear over problems of chemistry, no less than problems of crime. I spoke before, Watson, of wax dropped in haste, and of a poker heated to imitate the burning of a seal. I think now I understand the whole sequence, though I confess it required this second examination to see it clearly. The wax was not burned in this fire at all, in the sense of a seal cast into the flames. It was reheated upon this poker's handle, softened until it took again something of its original form, and then allowed to drop and cool upon the hearthstone, there to be discovered by Inspector Garrity's very thorough and very misled search of the ashes. A false trail, Watson, laid with real materials, but a wholly fictitious purpose, the appearance of a seal destroyed by fire, when in truth no seal was ever burned at all. Then the whole apparatus of the fire, the fragment of correspondence paper, the note left for Sir Malcolm, all of it was designed not to destroy the order, but to conceal the fact that it had merely been moved. Precisely so, and designed, moreover, by a mind of no small resource. Consider what such a scheme required, Watson. It required intimate knowledge of the court's daily procedure, sufficient to know when the room would stand briefly unwatched. It required access to the document press, whether by key or by the simple opportunity of an unlocked hour. It required the leisure and the nerve to fabricate not one false trail but several, each pointing toward a different innocent party, and each just plausible enough to occupy Garrity's honest but unimaginative attention. And it required, above all, a purpose that did not end with the mere destruction of a piece of paper, for a man who wished only to see Renshaw freed might have simply burned the order outright and been done with it. This was not the work of mercy, Watson, This was the work of calculation. He set down the poker and stood a moment in silence, his eyes travelling once more about the orderly room, as though reading, in its very tidiness, the signature of the mind that had arranged it so. The field narrows sharply, Watson, when you consider what manner of person required not Renshaw's freedom, but Sir Malcolm's embarrassment. Someone with access to this room, a familiarity with its procedures that neither Keene nor Price could claim, and a reason to wish the trial delayed rather than prevented outright. I think before the day is out we shall have our answer, and I think moreover that it will surprise Sir Malcolm a good deal more than it surprises either of us. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the logical guilt. At Holmes's request, Sir Malcolm assembled the whole company that evening in the courtroom itself, a fitting stage, I thought, for the conclusion of an affair that had begun and unfolded entirely within its walls. Price stood near the door, his professional composure not quite masking his eagerness. Miss Vane sat apart, pale but composed. Bell fidgeted with the chain of his watch. The Reverend Keene occupied a chair near the bench, his mild face grave with an anxiety I could not wholly interpret. Captain Hatherley leaned against the window frame in an attitude of studied unconcern, though I fancied his eyes moved rather more restlessly than his posture suggested. Sir Malcolm himself stood beside the magistrate's bench, his hand resting upon it as though upon some talisman of his authority. Holmes stood before them all, and I confess that even after so many years of witnessing such scenes, I never lost the particular thrill of watching my friend gather the scattered threads of a mystery into a single cord before an audience unaware until the final moment of where that cord must lead. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, "because the affair of the vanished committal order is at an end, and because I believe each of you is owed, in justice, an account of how the truth was found, and of how very nearly it was buried beneath falsehoods not of my making." His eyes moved slowly over the assembled company. I will say first what should perhaps have been evident from the beginning. The order was never destroyed. It was removed deliberately and with considerable skill, by a hand thoroughly familiar with the procedures of this court, and it has been in safe keeping, though not in this room, from that hour to this. A murmur passed through the company. Sir Malcolm's knuckles whitened upon the bench. The motive for this act, Holmes continued, was not mercy, though mercy was made to appear its likely parent. It was not revenge for an old injustice, though an old injustice exists, and very nearly misled me into supposing it the key to this affair. It was not political ambition, nor professional advancement, though both were canvassed in my mind before I discarded them. He paused. It was fear, gentlemen, and fear of a very particular and pressing kind. He turned, and I saw his gaze settle at last without haste or drama upon Captain Hatherley. "Captain Hatherley, I believe it was you who removed the order from this room, and you who devised, with considerable ingenuity, the several false trails that have occupied us these past days." The captain's languid posture stiffened, though his voice, when he answered, retained something of its former carelessness. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes, and I think you will find it wants proof. I have proof enough, and I will give it to you plainly, that you may judge its weight for yourself." Holmes's tone did not rise, but it took on a hardness I had heard in him before, at the close of many such interviews. "You had encouraged, secretly and for your own purposes, the very eviction dispute that led Renshaw to strike your uncle's steward. Your object was to discredit that steward's management of the estate, and thereby to gain for yourself a greater voice, and eventually a greater control over its affairs upon which, I have learned, your income depends rather more heavily than your manner has suggested. Renshaw, brought fully to trial, might have revealed under questioning that he had been encouraged in his resistance by a member of the family he believed sympathetic to his cause, even as that same member professed loyalty to his uncle in public. You could not permit that testimony to reach open court." "A theory, Mr. Holmes, and an ingenious one," said the captain, though his colour had altered. "You will forgive me if I decline to be convicted upon your eloquence alone. I do not ask you to be. Consider then the particulars. The document press stood briefly unlocked upon the very afternoon in question, a circumstance for which Mr. Bell, in honest confusion, could not fully account, but which I now believe arose because you yourself, familiar with the room and its habits, contrived to find it so, or perhaps unlocked it in a moment's opportunity while Mr. Bell dined. You removed the order, pressed it beneath the missing brass paperweight together with some other bundle of papers you carried from the room, under cover of an ordinary errand, and thereby smuggled it past any eye that might have remarked a single document departing alone. You then constructed with real materials but false purpose the appearance of its destruction, a fragment of ordinary correspondence paper burned in the grate to resemble the order's own signature, and sealing wax reheated upon the poker and allowed to fall, that Inspector Garrity's search of the ashes might find precisely the confirmation his honest mind was disposed to seek. You composed, in a disguised hand, a note calculated to direct suspicion toward the Reverend Keene, whose sympathies for Renshaw were public and well known, and you called upon Northgate Jail under the pretext of a message from your uncle, there to clip a corner from the delivery book, removing, I believe, some notation that would otherwise have raised inconvenient questions about the order's true progress. Captain Hatherley said nothing, but I saw the last of his careless bravado drain from his face, leaving something considerably less composed beneath it. Motive is not proof, Captain, and I have been at pains throughout this inquiry not to mistake the one for the other, Holmes went on, but the physical evidence forms a chain no ingenuity can wholly break. The paperweight and its telltale fibre, the wax upon the poker, and its second, harder trace beneath, the impression left upon the blotting sheet, the clipped slip at the jail, and the clay from the Northgate road that clung, when first we met you, to your own boots. He paused, and his voice, when he continued, held something almost of regret. And I think, Captain, that we shall find the order itself has not travelled far. A dispatch case, I believe, makes a very convenient hiding place for a man who does not wish to entrust his secret to any drawer or desk that might be searched by others. It was Sir Malcolm himself, moving with a suddenness that belied his age, who crossed to where the captain's dispatch case lay upon a side table and threw back its lid. Beneath a false panel of cardboard, fitted with evident care into the lining, lay a folded sheet of thick blue paper, sealed still with the magistrate's own red wax. The silence that followed seemed to me to last a very long while. "I acknowledge before you condemn me further," said Captain Hatherley at last, in a voice from which all lightness had fled, "that I have been a fool, and worse than a fool. I meant Renshaw no lasting harm, Mr. Holmes, only delay enough to see my own position secured before the truth of that eviction could be examined too closely. I did not foresee how far the thing would spread, nor how many innocent people I should leave standing beneath its shadow." "That, Captain," said Holmes gravely, "is very often the way of such schemes. They are conceived in a narrow moment of fear, and grow, in the execution, far beyond what their author first intended." Chapter 10. Law, Mercy, and Reason. Captain Hatherley was taken into custody that same night, and I will not dwell over long upon the scene that followed, for there is little pleasure in recording a proud family's humiliation, however justly earned. Inspector Garrity, to his credit, accepted the collapse of his earlier theory with better grace than I had expected, and set about the business of formal arrest with a thoroughness that went some way toward redeeming his earlier want of penetration. The Reverend Keene's confession was, of course, at once withdrawn, and I confess I watched his release from custody with a satisfaction not unmixed with unease. He came to us at the Crown before our departure, his mild face troubled still. "I do not repent the impulse that led me to shield him, Mr. Holmes, whatever folly it involved. I believed, when I gave my word, that I was protecting a man whose faults sprang from some better motive than I now know it did. I am ashamed to have been so mistaken, and ashamed, too, of the lie I told in his defence." "You are ashamed of a generous error, Mr. Keene, which is a very different failing from the crime you so nearly answered for," Holmes replied. "I would not have you carry the weight of it too heavily. A man's willingness to sacrifice himself for another even mistakenly bestowed, speaks rather to his credit than against it. Yet I confess, as I watch the clergyman depart, that his readiness to lie so convincingly, and to maintain that lie under considerable pressure, left in me a small residue of unease that I did not think it kind to voice aloud. A man capable of such loyalty was, I reflected, also a man capable of a certain flexibility with truth, and I wondered, not for the first time, how thin a line separates virtue from its darker cousin. Miss Vane was, of course, wholly cleared of suspicion, and I was glad to see something of her earlier composure return to her as the affair drew to its close. Old Bell, too, was spared the quiet dismissal he had so dreaded, for Holmes took some pains to explain to Sir Malcolm precisely how the old clerk's honest habits had been exploited by a mind considerably less scrupulous than his own, and Sir Malcolm, whatever his faults, was not so unjust as to punish a man for an error he had not, in fact, committed. Sir Malcolm himself I found greatly altered by the affair, though the alteration showed itself less in his words than in a certain diminishment of bearing, as though some rigid support within him had quietly given way. He received Holmes in his study on the morning of our departure, and thanked him with a formality that could not entirely conceal the depth of feeling beneath it. "You have restored the dignity of my office, Mr. Holmes, though I confess it comes at a cost I had not anticipated. My own nephew, sir? I do not know that I shall recover easily from the knowledge of it." "I would suggest to you, Sir Malcolm," said Holmes, with a gravity I had not often heard him employ toward those he had served, "that the affair has cost you a nephew, but may yet gain you something of greater value, if you are willing to receive it. Legality without mercy invites, sooner or later, a rebellion of the conscience, whether in a labourer driven to strike a steward, or in a nephew driven to a scheme of concealment rather than an honest reckoning with his debts. I do not say the law was wrong to punish Renshaw for his blow. I say only that the manner of its administration, in your hands, has left rather more bitterness in this district than strict justice required." Sir Malcolm made no immediate answer, and I did not think, from the stiffness of his expression, that Holmes's words had found any easy welcome. Yet Price informed us some weeks later by letter that Sir Malcolm had of his own accord reduced the charges laid against Renshaw, and had permitted a fuller hearing of the circumstances surrounding the eviction than the young man's counsel had dared hope for. Renshaw was not acquitted outright, nor should he have been, for he had indeed struck a blow that the law could not simply overlook. But he was tried, at the last, as a man rather than as an instrument in another's scheme, and received a sentence considerably lighter than the one first contemplated. We returned to London the following day, the winter countryside sliding past our carriage window in much the same grey monotony that had greeted our arrival, though I confess the case itself had left me in a reflective humour that the weather did little to dispel. "It is a curious thing, Holmes," said I as the train gathered speed, "that a case which began with no blood spilled, no violence beyond a single blow struck in desperation, should have left me more trouble than half the sensational affairs we have investigated together." "Blood is the least interesting ingredient of crime, Watson, though it is invariably the most remarked upon," Holmes replied, settling back against the cushions with his eyes half closed. "This affair has shown us three separate kinds of guilt operating within a single small community, and it is rare, I think, that they present themselves so cleanly for examination. There was the legal guilt of Renshaw, plain and undisputed, yet complicated by circumstances the law is not always disposed to weigh. There was the moral guilt of Sir Malcolm, who broke no statute in suppressing that old deposition, yet whose hardness sowed a bitterness that very nearly cost an innocent clergyman his liberty. And there was the logical guilt of Captain Hatherley, provable by evidence alone, and answerable in the end to neither sentiment nor scripture, but to the plain arithmetic of fact. And which, in your judgment, is the graver offence?" Holmes was silent a while, watching the field slip past. "The law can punish only the last, Watson, for it is the only one susceptible of proof. But I have long since ceased to suppose that the law's silence upon a matter, is the same thing as that matter's innocence. He opened his eyes and regarded me with something of his old dry humour. You will write this case up, I have no doubt, in your usual sentimental fashion, and I dare say your readers will find in it the satisfaction of a mystery solved. I would ask only that you let them see, if you can manage it without excessive moralising, that the solving of a mystery does not always answer the questions that gave it birth. I have tried, in setting down this account, to honour that request as faithfully as I am able, though I confess the temptation to sentiment is one I have never entirely mastered. As we drew at last into the smoke and clamour of Euston, and the ordered stillness of Brackley receded behind us like a dream half remembered, I found myself turning over Holmes's final words upon the matter, spoken as the cab carried us home through the gathering dusk toward Baker Street. "Mercy may soften justice, Watson," said he, "but it must never be allowed to counterfeit fact." I have set the sentence down here precisely as he spoke it, for I have found, in the years since, that few words of his have stayed with me so persistently, nor illuminated so plainly the strange and difficult ground upon which the law, and the conscience that must answer to it, are so often required to stand together.